Hey everyone, and welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking into isolation, and you know how it can impact power dynamics.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we've got this really interesting mix of sources for this one. We've got some history, some philosophy, a little bit of strategy thrown in there, and it's all kind of coming together to ask this one big question.
Okay.
Is isolating yourself the best way to stay safe, or is it actually kind of setting yourself up for trouble?
It is interesting, isn't it? We often think about physical barriers when we think about safety.
Right.
We build walls and fortresses and gated communities, all with this idea that if we can just keep the outside world OUT, then we'll be protected.
Makes sense on the surface.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's see if that really holds up today.
All right, so to kick things off, we're going all the way back to ancient China with this guy, Emperor Shi Huangti. He was the very first emperor of a unified China, driven by ambition, and I think it's fair to say a healthy dose of ruthlessness. And he was a big believer in the whole fortress idea, like took it to a whole other level.
Oh, yeah. He was all about that fortress life.
Yeah.
Shi Huangti's fortress. I mean, it was colossal, designed to be completely impenetrable, this symbol of his power, and of course his safe haven from anyone who wanted to cause him trouble. Imagine the resources, the manpower, the sheer effort it took to build this ultimate safe space.
It sounds like the very definition of security,
Right.
but there's got to be a twist here. It feels like we're heading into be careful what you wish for territory.
Yeah, you're picking up what we're putting down.
Ah,
So Shi Huangti's obsession with security and control, well, it kind of backfired. This fortress, the one he built to protect him, it turned into this gilded cage, a breeding ground for his own paranoia and his isolation.
he's giving off some serious Mask of the Red Death vibes, don't you think? You know, that Edgar Allan Poe story.
Yeah, I see it.
Where Prince Prospero tries to escape the plague by locking himself and all the nobles in this crazy elaborate abbey.
Uh-huh.
But spoiler alert, death finds a way in.
It always does.
Yeah, always did.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. By walling himself off, Shi Huangti completely lost touch with what was going on outside the fortress, alienated his people, and he just became totally blind to all this discontent that was brewing outside those walls.
So he basically made himself more vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. It proves that isolation sometimes can actually create the danger it's trying to prevent.
Wow. So isolating himself to stay safe actually made him low safe Phoebus. Ironic.
It really is.
Yeah. But maybe this was just like a one-time thing.
Okay.
You know?
Oh.
A mistake from a bygone era.
That's what's so fascinating about this. It's not just an ancient China problem. This pattern of isolation leading to downfall, it pops up again and again throughout history. Fast forward to 17th century France, and we meet another ruler with a pretty similar story.
Okay.
Louis XIV, the Sun King.
Ooh, the Sun King.
He had his court in the magnificent Palace of Versailles.
Oh, yeah.
But even with all that grandeur and splendor, that same sense of isolation was at play.
Versailles. The ultimate gilded cage, right?
Yeah.
It's a masterpiece of architecture, sure.
Mm-hmm.
But I've always wondered about what it must have been like to live in such a controlled environment.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it? Versailles was more than just a palace. It was Louis XIV's way of controlling the French nobility. He brought them all under one roof, so to speak,
Oh, I see.
and imposed this ridiculously elaborate system of etiquette and rituals.
Oh, wow.
It created an atmosphere of constant scrutiny and competition.
Yeah. I can only imagine the drama. It sounds like a reality show waiting to happen.
Oh, totally. All these nobles constantly vying for the king's favor, always on edge, never really knowing who to trust.
Yeah.
So on the surface, it seemed like Louis XIV had it all under control. He was the Sun King, right? Radiating power and authority.
Uh-huh.
But underneath all that, Versailles was a breeding ground for suspicion and paranoia, even among the people closest to the king. It's a stark reminder that even when you're surrounded by people, isolating yourself can have these seriously detrimental effects. You might be physically present, but are you really connected?
Right. So just projecting this image of power wasn't enough. To truly rule effectively, Louis XIV needed to be in touch with his people to understand their needs, their anxieties.
Exactly. And that actually brings us to one of the most insightful thinkers on the topic of power, Niccolo Machiavelli.
Ooh, Machiavelli,
Yeah.
the OG of power politics.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Machiavelli, he's often associated with ruthlessness and cunning,
Right.
but he was also a really sharp observer of human nature,
Yeah.
and his insights on power, well, they're remarkably relevant even today.
So Machiavelli, the guy who practically wrote the book on power and politics, what did he have to say about isolation and how it affects leadership?
Well, he wasn't a fan of the fortress mentality.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he actually thought rulers who shut themselves away in fortresses were making a huge mistake.
I guess because they'd be cut off from important information and potential allies, right?
You got it. Think about it. If you're holed up in your fortress, all your information is coming from just a handful of people. Your advisors, your guards.
Yep.
You're not out there seeing what's actually happening, hearing the rumblings of discontent, understanding the needs of the people you're ruling.
So it's not just about projecting strength and authority.
Yeah.
You have to stay connected to what's happening on the ground.
Exactly. Machiavelli believed that power, it's inherently social. It's all about building relationships, understanding people's motivations, and being able to spot threats and opportunities before they even happen.
Right.
And you can't do any of that if you're isolated physically or even just metaphorically from the world around you.
Yeah, it's like trying to play chess when you can only see half the board.
Exactly. You're bound to make some bad moves.
For sure. So to illustrate this point, let's jump to a leader who really seemed to get this whole balance between protecting himself and staying connected. Cosimo de' Medici.
Okay, yeah.
Cosimo de' Medici, the mastermind of Renaissance Florence.
Yeah.
He wasn't an emperor or a king,
Mm.
but he was one of the most powerful people in Italy.
Oh, absolutely. Cosimo was a brilliant strategist, known for his political smarts. But unlike Shi Huangti, or Louis XIV, he didn't isolate himself. He knew how important it was to be present among the people, to build relationships, gather information, and really sense the shifts in public opinion.
So it sounds like Cosimo understood that real power comes not from shutting yourself away, but from connecting with people and understanding what they want and need.
Exactly. And there's this really fascinating story about an artist named Pontormo. He was commissioned by Cosimo to paint frescoes in a chapel.
Okay.
Now, Pontormo, for reasons we don't quite know, he developed a terrible fear of human contact.
Oh, wow.
And he basically became a recluse, shut himself away, isolated from everyone, even while he was working on this huge project.
That's almost paradoxical. Creating art, which is all about communication and connection,
Right.
but at the same time, isolating yourself from the very people who will experience that art.
It is. And what's even more interesting is that Pontormo's isolation actually caused him to fail. He couldn't finish the frescoes. His inability to connect, to engage with the world around him, it was his downfall. And it's a huge contrast to Cosimo, who thrived on those very connections.
Wow. So we're seeing that this idea of isolation, it's not just about physical walls.
Right.
It's about this bigger idea of being cut off from information, relationships, from different points of view. And whether that's something you choose or something that just happens, it can have some serious consequences.
Absolutely. And this brings us to the psychological effects of isolation, which can be pretty profound. You see, as humans, we're wired for connection. We're social creatures. We need those interactions, those bonds to thrive. And when we don't have them, it really messes with how we see reality.
Yeah, it makes you more vulnerable to fear, anxiety, and paranoia, right? Because you're not getting that outside input to help you think straight, to question your assumptions.
Yeah. Exactly. And when you're isolated, it becomes easier to fall into these distorted ways of thinking, to see threats that aren't really there, to make decisions based on fear instead of logic.
Like being stuck in an echo chamber.
Yes. Where all you hear are your own thoughts and fears just bouncing around and getting louder.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So how do we avoid that? How do we stay connected, engaged, and informed without feeling overwhelmed by everything that's happening in the world?
Now, that's $1 million question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. It's about finding the right balance, that sweet spot where you're protecting yourself without completely shutting yourself off. It's about being deliberate about the information you take in, the people you surround yourself with, and the things you choose to do.
It's kind of weird to think about, right? Like we live in this age of crazy connection with the internet and social media and everything. But at the same time, it feels like more and more people are feeling isolated.
Yeah, it's a total paradox. You'd think with all these ways to connect, isolation would be gone. But the truth is, technology can be a double-edged sword. Yeah, on one hand, it helps us connect with people all over the world, access information instantly, and build these online communities. But on the other hand, it can also make us feel disconnected from the real world, from face-to-face interactions, from those deep, meaningful relationships that really matter.
It's almost like we're surrounded by all these connections.
Right.
But we're starving for that genuine connection.
Exactly.
Right.
We might have thousands of friends online, but how many of them feel real? How many would we actually turn to if we needed help? And how often do we find ourselves scrolling through social media, comparing our lives to these perfect little snapshots that other people are putting out there, and
Oh.
it just makes us feel even more isolated.
So it's not just about how many connections you have.
Right.
It's about the quality of those connections.
Exactly. And that's something we really need to pay attention to, especially in today's world. It's easy to get caught up in this illusion of connection
Yeah.
without realizing the toll it's taking on our mental and emotional well-being.
Yeah. So true. So
Yeah.
how do we make sure we're making those quality connections?
Well, it all comes down to being intentional about the choices we make. We need to step back from the digital noise, make time for real conversations, face-to-face interactions, and experiences that foster that true connection.
So it's all about finding that balance.
Absolutely. Embrace the good things about technology,
Right.
but don't let it replace real human interaction.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And you know what? It's also about noticing those little ways we might be isolating ourselves. Like maybe we're canceling plans more often, or working late more days,
Yeah.
or just retreating into our comfort zones.
Yeah.
Or just retreating into our comfort zones
Yeah.
because we're scared or anxious.
It's so easy to do, especially when the world feels overwhelming.
Right.
But it can become a slippery slope.
Yeah.
Those little choices can lead us further and further away from the connections that really matter.
So how do we stop ourselves from going down that path?
Well, it starts with being self-aware, checking in with ourselves,
Fine.
and asking, am I connecting with the world in a way that feels good? Or am I slowly withdrawing into isolation? And if it's the second one, what's one small thing I can do today to change that?
Yeah. Maybe it's something as simple as calling a friend instead of texting them,
Yeah.
or having dinner with family, or
Yep.
joining a club,
Exactly.
or even just starting a conversation with someone new at the coffee shop.
It doesn't have to be some big dramatic thing. It's those small, consistent actions that break down the walls of isolation and remind us how powerful human connection can be.
It's so true. As we wrap up this deep dive, I can't stop thinking about all the different ways isolation can show up in our lives. Not just physically, but emotionally and mentally.
It really is everywhere.
Yeah. It's a reminder to be aware, to nurture those connections, and to remember that real strength and security, they come from engaging with the world, not shutting ourselves off from it.
And remember, you're not alone in this. We all crave connection. We need it to thrive. And when we make an effort to build those bridges, those relationships, we're not just making our own lives better, we're also creating a more connected, compassionate, and understanding world.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the dangers of isolation. Until next time, stay connected and keep exploring.